for joining for today's session. Uh, so, how to prepare for NPTEL exam? I would suggest. No, I'm not sure about. I think it has to. The questions will be asked from the concept that have been discussed in the video. So, I would suggest is have a look at through those videos. Try to have a look at the assignments once again, and you can also have a look at some of the sessions we had. So that you can you know I mean to say you can have a you can go back through those classes and then refurbish your whatever you had learned. Hope yeah. So I presume they are not going to ask anything out of what was taught in the class in the session. So I think that might be an thing thing we should do. Okay. So yeah, with that, uh, so since this is the last session for this course that I'll be taking these sessions. Uh, so I thought of I will be just going what I have been going the way I have been going all across. But if you have any clarifications, I can after the end of session, I can wait for 10 to 15 minutes to help you understand some of those concepts if you are not able to grasp. Okay, so that's all. So let's just start. What all is there for today? So obviously we're going to just have a look at we're going to look at week 7 assignment solution, and then since this week 8 is about concepts related to ecology, we'll have a look at some of those concepts and then few examples how or why do we tend to study ecology, trying to understand. Okay, okay. So let's go ahead. So which planetary boundary is associated with excessive use of fertilizers and pesticides in agriculture? So we have land system change, freshwater use, biogeochemical flows, and climate change. So what happens, especially with fertilizers and pesticides use in agriculture, is we are altering uh, the biogeochemical cycles. So, for instance, we are adding NPK fertilizer, which are no, oh, it is C. So this is from the previous assignment. Uh, so what happens is we are adding elements which are generally found in lower concentration. We are increasing the concentrations from what it is ideal. We are not changing the land use here. It's not about changing the land system. Like if you are cutting the forest and converting it to agriculture, then it will be land system change. But that's not what we're doing. We are adding fertilizers and pesticides, and that to excessive use. So that is altering the biogeochemical flows. So how, for instance, if you talk about nitrogen cycle, if you are adding a lot of nitrogen into the soil, taking a lot of nitrogen from the air, we're essentially imbalancing it out. So that's where this is about. Okay. So yeah, the Anthropocene is primarily defined by changes in biodiversity, geological and atmospheric alterations caused by human activities, natural climatic fluctuations, oceanic currents and patterns. So the answer is obviously how we are altering the geological atmosphere. Yeah. So changes in biodiversity, natural climate fluctuations, oceanic currents and patterns. These are the things that have been happening over the recorded past in Earth's history. But geological and atmospheric alterations that we humans are causing is the reason why this area Anthropocene is defined by. Going ahead, which of the following is not a part of the constituents of sustainability? Evaluating options using ethical reasoning, implementing political strategy, developing assessments and options, generating short-term human and ecosystem welfare. So obviously, sustainability is not something you generate it for short term and then leave it. So these are strategies that we are advising to have long term goals of how to sustain ourselves, our growth, and simultaneously ecosystems. So going ahead, ethical problems comprise of questions of value in addition to questions of facts. True or false? It's true. So it's just not addition. It's just not questions of value. It also has questions of facts. So how? Yeah. Question number three. Okay. So you want me to go over it again? So the thing is, so which is not a part of sustainability. So evaluating options for ethical reasoning, developmental develop implementing political strategy, developing assessment and options. So for instance, if you talk about goals of sustainability, or if you're talking sustainable development, not only having the goals is important, you need to assess them how well you are reaching. So that is a component of sustainable development, right? While you have the multiple strategies simultaneously, political strategies to implement some of those goals, and you also have uh, ethical reasoning to identify which are which are the goals that we need to accomplish, right? Okay. So ethical problems comprise of facts, of questions of value in addition to questions of facts. That's true. Going ahead, under which ethical approach does contractarianism fall? It comes under deontology. Okay. So going ahead, in Kant's ethical framework, an action is morally good if it follows societal expectations and laws. It is motivated by desire for personal happiness. It can become a universal law. It aligns with the preference of the majority. So in this frame, in Kant's ethical framework, an action is morally good if it becomes an universal law. So whatever action a person does, it will be good if it's a law. It's a norm that you have to do. It's like for instance, help the poor. If it's a universal law, then the action is morally good. Going ahead, biocentrism is in environmental ethics advocates for which of the following? So, so it advocates for having equal consideration for all living beings and ecosystems. It's not like uh, not giving priority for some other species, or giving up for human interests above other species. Like for instance, you cut down forests because humans need places to need to stay and for agriculture. It's not how you do it. In biocentrism, you give equal consideration for humans, other species, and also ecosystems. Also. So according to Guha, the deep ecology movement tends to overlook the economic realities of third world nations. So yeah, that's a problem that is you know the, because most third world nations are economically lagging. So the ecology movement doesn't try to include that aspect. According to Bourdieu's theory, if you run a good sanitation system, you are not a agent, donor, payer, beneficiary. So the answer is beneficiary. So called centrifugal forces of urbanization. So what are some of those things that causes you know urbanization to happen a lot with centrifugal forces? may basically uh, leads to much more urbanization. Urbanization of an area leads to much more urbanization, congestion, and urban land. So these are some of those centrifugal forces that are involved in urbanization, right? So that's all about uh, the previous week's assignment questions. So yeah, so since this week the module is about ecology, I thought of uh, discussing some of those concepts that were touched upon briefly in the class sessions. So I thought of discussing some of those concepts in detail, and yeah, try to introduce few more new interesting ones with some examples. And if you couldn't understand, if you have any doubts, feel free to stop me and yeah, ask them so that you can clear it up here. So going ahead, so the word ecology in general, it, it's not a single word. It's a word that is formed from two different words, oikos and logos, meaning household and study. Basically, study of household, of what? So ecology, it can also be defined as a scientific study of interactions among organisms and their environment. So how different organisms interact with their environment, or it can also be defined as the interactions among organisms that determine the distribution and abundance of them. So, what are the interactions that determine how species are present and how their abundances are distributed across place? Okay, uh, so basically, you are trying to understand how species interact within the environment and how those interactions change with their environment. So that is ecology. And so ecology is, so it's a bigger group. So it also has multiple subfields. For instance, we have landscape ecology, where you study processes that happens at the landscape level. Like for instance, a bigger area, like a huge protected area, or huge area such as like Western Ghats. So the huge areas, when you're studying whole landscapes together. What are processes? What are things that are happening in the landscape? So you call that type of ecology as landscape ecology. You have wildlife ecology, where you study about managing wildlife populations or conserving wildlife populations by understanding how things go around within those species or different species together. You have movement ecology, wherein you study how species move across areas. It can be such, for instance, migration is one such example of movement ecology, because it is such an interesting phenomena that happens every year. Species move from one area to another, traveling huge distances. If you want to understand how, which path they take, or how do they travel, or how long they will take. So all these things are covered under movement ecology. And there is population ecology, where you tend to study single species, how the population changes over time, or, or over seasons, or across area. So these things help us really understand what is happening with the species. So for instance, if you want to understand how the species reproduce and all, or other aspects of its population, so that regime comes under population ecology. While since humans, we have been converting most of this, cutting down most of these forests, building up most of these urban green spaces or urban areas. So it's not like these places are devoid of any animals or plants. So there are some species that that tends to favor some of these urban areas. So when you study how those species, which species fare, how do they survive in these landscapes, or how species get out of these landscapes, how move around these landscapes, you tend to call that study as urban ecology. And there is this other thing called global change ecology, where you try to understand how humans are impacting the global change, biogeochemical cycles or some other aspects of it. And there are other cycles also, other different types of ecologies. This is just a list. It's not a complete list, but these are some of the major things. There is community ecology also, where you are studying multiple species that are in a of a single taxa that are present in a single geographical location. How do the species change? So that is community ecology. So you have multiple different subfields in ecology, right? Uh, yeah. So yeah. So when you study most of the species, there is this term that comes up called habitat. Can someone say what is an habitat, or what do you think is a habitat of a species? If you have any answer, you can unmute yourself and respond, or you can type it in the chat box also. What do you guys think is an habitat? Okay. In case you're not able to answer, but just try to understand what is it. So this is a picture of a snow leopard, right? All of you might have heard about it or seen photographs of it. So where do you think this species is found in these options A, B, C, D? Where all where all places, which all places do you think the species occurs, or the species is can be seen? Uh, Species living in nature. Okay, near close. So what do you think the snow leopard's home is of these four different landscapes, A, B, C, D? Where all in the snow leopard can be found? Uh, any guesses? Even if you're wrong, don't worry. I can help you understand it. No response. Okay. So, since snow leopard, if you might have heard, is a species that is found in higher altitudes, means more than 3,000 meters in height, and then it's a species that you can see in mountains. So mountainous region. So these are the places where the species can be found. So that is what you know the definition of habitat. That's how we define habitat. Is where the environment of the species, or where the species is present, where what is its natural home. So that's what someone tried to say earlier also, right? So that is what a habitat refers to. And since you're talking about a species habitat, not all of the species are found everywhere. Some species are restricted to some areas. That's why sometimes conserving those species becomes so important. Like for instance, this bird called Bugunleo chikla. It's found in uh, this. near to this village called Bugun, and it's found in just that Eagle Nest Wildlife Sanctuary in Arunachal Pradesh, and it just found in very few populations, hardly, I think around 30 individuals of the species exist. So these sort of these sort of distributions are called endemic. These sort of species are called endemic because they are found in just in few locations and are not found in anywhere else. So these species are called endemic species. However, so this is a bird that all of you might have seen. It's called a rose-ringed parrot. So if you see where all it's present in India, it's present all across India, most of across India, apart from higher up in the Himalayas, and you have the species in central tropical Africa also, subtropical Africa, in south little bit of Myanmar. So since this is has very widespread distribution, these species are called widespread. However, there are some species that you see in India, but they are non-native to India. Their original distribution is something here, but because of humans, this species is found here. So these type of species are called exotic species. And then there is a case of invasive species. Its distribution is somewhere else. It has come down into India and has invaded into ecosystems, meaning it replaces most of the native species, harms them, doesn't allow them to come, competes with them, and then yeah, and takes over those ecosystems. So these are all class. How do we classify species based on their distribution? So where all they are present? Okay, endemic, widespread, exotic, invasive. Uh, so all of you might have heard of a little bit about natural selection and Darwin, right? So so since Darwin was a great naturalist at that time, you know, uh, so what happened was there was this expedition. There were expeditions that used to go around, going to these islands, remote islands, trying to find, what's the faunal wealth, what all fauna, flora is present. So what happened was during one such expedition to Madagascar, some explorers found this orchid. It's called Madagascar star orchid. Appearance, it looks like a star. So what happened? They collected this orchid and they have sent it to Darwin. So Darwin, when he saw this orchid, and this is the corolla tube of the orchid. So this is where that tube that you see in normal flowers comes to. So once he saw this huge tube, he said that if whatever pollinator pollinates has to have this long, you know, uh, should be able to reach the nectar at the base of this flower because this is such a huge flower, right? So he predicted it to be a hawk moth. It's a moth that has this huge long proboscis that should be able to reach there and drink up the nectar and in the process carry the pollen and pollinate the orchid. But at that time, no one has found that moth. But later on, they found this huge moth, and they named it Xanthopan predicta. Predicta means it's a predicted moth in acknowledging the fact that this presence of this species has been predicted by Darwin. And for instance, this is how a normal hawk moth looks like, and this is how the length of the proboscis looks like. Basically, it's a tongue for moths and butterflies. So, for instance, see how long the proboscis of that specific moth is. So, somewhere around 24 centimeters is the length of the proboscis of this species. So, this is such an interesting uh, example where both species have evolved together, you know, and it has been nicely predicted by Darwin. So these are some of those interesting things that you end up finding in ecology. And simultaneously, there is this thing called mutualism. You might have heard this concept of mutualism, where both partners in an interaction benefit from the interaction. Okay. For instance, there is this group of ants in Americas, tropical Americas, of this genus called Pseudomyrmex, and then they interact with this plant called acacia. So what do they do? As everyone of most of us might have experienced, when we disturb ants, they come, bite, sting, and then shoo us away. Basically, we don't go near to the plants that has a lot of ants or wherever there are ants because they are very aggressive. They defend the plant that they are on. So the plant uses this strategy to defend itself from herbivores, from other plants. So what does it? How does it do? It provides a home in its one of these thorns, so that these ants can nest inside and also provide food. So these are the leaves of the plant, and there are these yellow bodies that are produced for specifically the ants to harvest, so that ants can collect them and then feed themselves during very lean seasons, and simultaneously protect them. So these are some of the interesting things that you see end up seeing in nature, and these interactions are also studied, in when you are studying ecology. So yeah, so how are these systems organized? When since we are talking about species and those interactions, for instance, atoms, we all know that how they are organized. If you look at the organization of an organism, single individual of a single species, you have cells that together form a tissue, that together form a organ, and organs together forms a organ system. Basically, body multiple organ systems together form a body of a single species. And a single species is generally referred to as individual, right? And many such individuals of a single species together forms a population. So when you're studying population ecology, you're basically studying many number of individuals of a single species, and many such species together comprise a community. As I was saying earlier, you have many number of species in a community, and once when you study different type of species present in a area, you're basically studying trying to understand the communities. And then a little bit higher, multiple such communities together form an ecosystem, right? And then similarly, you have multiple such ecosystems coming up together to form biomes, different type of biomes, and then different type of biomes together form the biosphere. In basically, biosphere is the living part of Earth, right? So let's just have a look at different type of ecosystems and biomes, because these are something that communities and populations changes with the species or the groups you generally look at. So let's just have a look at different type of ecosystems. For instance, we have terrestrial ecosystems. Most of these ecosystems that are on the land, and then you have freshwater ecosystems. Rivers, lakes, ponds, streams, all this together comes into freshwater ecosystem. And then you have marine ecosystems, all coral reefs, deep water, the ocean, or all of this comes under marine ecosystems. Sometimes you study specific ecosystems. Either you study terrestrial ecosystems like savanna, or you try to study sometimes in tropical rainforest. So you're basically studying a specific type of terrestrial ecosystems, right? So yeah, Broadly, they can be classified into these three categories. So the next level of organization is biomes, right? So we have these biomes, like some around nine of these biomes: tropical rainforest, temperate rainforest, boreal forest, tundra, temperate seasonal forest, shrubland, tropical seasonal forest or savanna, subtropical desert, cool desert. So basically, most of these biomes can be arranged on just two axes. So one axis is temperature. What is the annual temperature of that area? And then what is the annual precipitation that happens in that area? Temperature and rainfall. So, for instance, you have higher temperatures but very low rainfall. What you have is a subtropical desert. For instance, Sahara Desert or the desert that is in India, right? So that comes under this biome, subtropical desert. For instance, if your temperatures are very low, still you have low precipitation. What you have is called cold desert. This region, where you have sub-zero temperatures, you have cold deserts, or you have temperate grasslands, or you have both temperature and precipitation in very low category. You have what is called a tundra. Okay, this is what is found in mostly in the northern latitudes, and so is boreal forests. You have little higher amount of precipitation compared to tundra, but you have little slightly warmer temperatures. When you have highest precipitation and highest annual temperature, the biome that you see is mostly the tropical rainforest, right? And then similarly, savannas and so on. And yeah, so there is this concept called biodiversity hotspots that was introduced in 2000 to prioritize areas for conservation. What all areas should be conserved. So we can't just go around say, let's start conserving the whole earth. That's not how that's not how we can do it. So it's not possible because we need places for us to live, for us to have resources, for us to develop, for to fulfill our needs also. And then we have to save places also. So what does this hotspots represent is those areas on earth that have exceptionally higher amount of endemic species. So if if you remember from earlier, endemic species are those that are just found in specific areas, and those areas are generally very tiny. And then human disturbances are very high, and then so you say if you let's try to conserve these type of areas. So these areas are biodiversity hotspots, and then there is an interesting, you know, uh, it has been these have been put forward as the areas that are needed to be conserved. And for instance, if you look in India, we have two such biodiversity hotspots. One is Western Ghats and Sri Lanka biodiversity hotspot. One is the Himalayan Indo-Burma biodiversity hotspot. This is a little older one, and most of these biodiversity hotspots have been updated. Even for instance, if you look at Brazilian forest, it is also a biodiversity hotspot. So that's one. So these are all understandings of conserve biodiversity hotspots comes because we have an understanding of how those species are distributed across, and which which species is endemic, which species is widely distributed, and which species need conservation prioritization because they are getting affected by humanity a lot. Okay, So, so other concept that was touched upon was the growth rate of species. So when you study population ecology, you try to understand how a species grows. Okay, okay. Uh, so when you try to study species, when you especially populations, you try to try to understand how the population changes across time. So for instance, so we generally try to plot those growth curves. So you call them growth curves. So generally there are two types of growth curves that are described. One is exponential growth, and the other one is logistic growth. So exponential growth is generally defined as the growth that is not constrained by any other factors. So the it just multiplies, it just goes on. For instance, if you take a bacteria cell and then put them in a nutrient rich media, so it just divides with time. One cell will become two cell becomes four will become eight 16. So it just multiplies with the with the 2 to the power of n. So the population size in that case will show something like this, right? So that sort of growth is called an exponential growth. So with just population, it just grows on like that. But and then that can be captured by this equation. So dn by dt is basically the population at time t is equal to rn. So the population growth, this r is the growth rate, n is the population at time t minus 1. So no need to worry about the equation as such. So basically here you're not constrained by anything. You just you all the resources, either it could be food, it could be space, it could be any other mates when you're talking about species. uh, so you are not constrained by anything, so you just grow exponentially. But that's not how species are, right? In if you see nature, something or another affects species. Either it could be there is not enough space for for the species to grow, or not enough resources for the species to feed, or there are predators that feeds on it, or there are competitors they have to compete for in terms of where they want to which area they want to use. So there is always a certain amount of individuals that can be supported by that system. Okay, so that in the limit that can be supported by the system is called carrying capacity. So the growth that a population shows when they are there is a limiting limit or set on how many individuals can be supported by the system is called logistic growth. So what happened in this growth? You don't have an exponential growth. You have the population initially rises till a certain point, and after which it starts slowing down. The population growth rate slows down, and the population size reaches the capacity, carrying capacity, or the limit set by the system. Okay, so where does this logistic growth or exponential growth models generally help us? So they are really helpful in understanding how populations are moving around. Or for instance, you know uh, if you are interested in, most of us eat fish harvested from oceans, right? So what happens, you can't really have you keep on harvesting fish, but you're also monitoring the fish population, because you don't want to fishes. So That is where this logistic growth model comes in. So if you have how the population is changing with time, a graph, and that can be derived from this equation. So you will know. So when the population is somewhere around half, population size, half of the carrying capacity, you will have the population growing at the fastest speed. So what you do is basically you try to harvest this number of individuals. If your population here, you try to harvest this number of individuals, and you don't go beyond that, because if you go beyond that, the population growth rate decreases. So you try to come close to this point, this red point, and try to harvest those many number of individuals. That's one way this logistic growth curve helps, you know, inform. And even in general, or in cases where you have no species relocations or translocations that has happened, movement of species from one protected area to another protected area, they want to monitor how the population has changed, whether it has reached carrying capacity or not. You can have, how the population has changed with time. You can calculate. You can try to understand those things based on these equations. Okay. And simultaneously, not only these things, they are also, these population growth models are also being used to understand how two species interact with each other. Those two species can be, a predator and a prey, or those two species can be two different competitors. Like for instance, it can be two species of rabbits, two different species of rabbit that are present in the same area, or it can be a rabbit and a predator. Like, here in this case, it's a woolly hair. Sorry, it's a hare and a lynx. So, uh, so you use these growth models because we know natural populations have certain carrying capacity, certain limit to what the population can grow. So we use that thing to plug it into a equation and see how the population changes when with respect to this species. So let's say, for instance, if the species is present in this number of individuals, how does it affect the prey? If the prey is present in this many number of individuals, how the predator, what will be the number of predators you see? So so this work has been done by two people, Lotka and Volterra, separately. So since they came up separately around the same time, these equations are called Lotka-Volterra equations. So they have been used for competitions also. So basically, they put up the equations earlier, but is it what happens in the nature or not? So these models or the equations that they are said, captures this thing, dynamics of how species go around. Is it captured in nature or not? So for that thing, what people have done was, during 1840s to 1840 1940s. So there is this uh, trade in Canadian lynx and hare furs. So they used to people used to go hunt down these animals, and then they used to come with those furs and then sell it to some people, some agency. So and that agency has been keeping records of how many furs have been collected that year, and how many furs of this species and how many furs of that species. So what they found was there was a cyclical movement. You know, once there is a higher number of predators, their prey will be low, and as the predator number gets down because there are very few prey, the prey increases because there are very few number of predators to kill them. Since there is huge number of prey, the predator also comes up. So it just goes on like this. But prey is generally present in higher number than predators, because predator need much large number of prey. And then this goes on, like cyclic, you know, they just go on oscillating motions while one following closely the other. So that's how they were able to verify some of those equations that were put forward earlier. So you're also not only studying a single species, you're also studying how do two different species interact also. This is really important when you are trying to monitor populations. For instance, you want to conserve, the species become very rare and you want to conserve. You know that it's not the species has gone. If you come here and try to find out how many individuals are there, if you know that these cycles have been happening, you can be assured that since the prey is less in number, if you manage to bring back the prey, the predator will obviously come back. So these are some of the way these these equations help us. And coming to the concept that we might have heard read about from earlier school days, food chain is nothing but graphical representation of how food food is transferred across. We have producers, the one that produces food, and then the consumers that just eat. They don't produce their own food, they just eat others because they find it very easy to do, right? So most of the producers are autotrophs. So producers are autotrophs. The consumers can also be referred to as heterotrophs because they can't produce their own food. They're dependent on others. And then autotrophs can be of two different types. The one that uses photosynthesis are called photoautotrophs because they use sunlight for synthesizing, you know, for synthesizing energy, or basically glucose here mostly. While in chemosynthesis, chemoautotrophs, what they do is they use the reactions chemicals to they reduce some chemicals and then they use chemicals the energy released from those reactions to make organic molecules. So here are basically carbohydrates, which are which is what photosynthesis makes. Use carbon dioxide, you reduce carbon dioxide, you make organic molecules, and that is what is processed in alimentation later on. So based on the source of energy, photoautotrophs and chemoautotrophs. Photoautotrophs are the ones prominently seen across, but chemoautotrophs are also seen, but they're mostly present in extreme environments. For instance, underwater volcanoes, or hot geothermal springs, where some of these bacteria can be seen. There are multiple types of food chains. Grazing food chain that starts where most species start with grazing. It's the first consumer where the chain starts from uh, eating up of dead organisms. Sorry, dead leaf matter, dead plant matter, dead fungus. Okay, so generally, grazing food chains are much more longer than detritus food chain because you have a lot of energy that can be transferred across levels. Unlike detritus food chain that has shorter, very less energy that can be transferred across. But seldom we don't generally see food chain that simple is just a grasshopper eating a plant, frog just eating a grasshopper, snake just eating a frog, bird just eating a snake. We see a lot of other interactions. The grasshopper is also eaten by a bird is eaten by fox, bird is also eaten by a snake, small bird is also eaten by big bird. There are these cross interactions that happen very much. So so when you include those interactions when you want to study together, so you refer those interactions as food web. It's just not you know food chain, it will become a food web. So similarly, we can classify the consumers based on their position. If they are eating the producer, you call primary, secondary, tertiary, quaternary, and so on. And similarly, you have decomposers that are also present in a food. So it just, it's just so complex. So how do these change? So we try to understand some of these food chains and food webs using these things called ecological pyramids. So these are basically nothing but graphical representation of how biomass, energy, or numbers at its trophic level change. So we call this as a single trophic level. If they are present in a single level, it's called a single trophic level. So it is a trophic level. So frog and bird here are in a same similar trophic level. So for instance, pyramid of numbers. If you see the pyramid of numbers, you have greater amount of producers that are at the base, and then as you go, the number of consumers tends to decline very much. So it looks like pyramid, upright pyramid. Okay, so this is pyramid of numbers. Where pyramid of numbers in some cases can also be inverted, but very few cases you see. For instance, you have grass. Okay, the number of herbivores that feeds on grass is higher, and then the number of parasites on these herbivores are much more higher. For instance, number of ticks present on a single cheetal can be way high, and there are fungi that attacks these ticks and fleas. So these are called hyperparasites. So sometimes the pyramid of numbers can also be upright, and even in marine ecosystems, you see sometimes you tend to see pyramid of numbers inverted. And biomass is also upright. Your greater biomass at the bottommost producers, consumers. As you reach the top of the trophic level or the food chain or food web, the topmost consumers are present in few, relatively less. They contribute less biomass, and this is what you call as a standing crop. So at each trophic level, so what is the amount of amount of biomass that is present? Weight or quantity of organisms in an area at a given moment is called standing crop. So this is sometimes helpful to understand, how the biomass changes across trophic levels. And then it's not like whatever energy is produced by producers, basically plants and grasses, is transferred to everything. So there is a loss of energy that happens, and most of this loss, sorry, happens as heat. Okay, as heat and assimilation. So most of and or waste, because let's say for instance, most of the energy, let's say producers has 100% of energy. So not all things that are produced by the plant is heated. For instance, plant dissipates some heat, plant respires, and then some of the leaves are also have also fallen down before a herbivore can graze on it. Similarly, as this goes on along the pyramid, in terms, the amount of energy available for the next trophic level goes on decreasing. So by a factor of around 10%. So if you have 100 joules of energy here, the next immediate trophic level can get only 10 joules of energy, and the immediate trophic level will get just 1 joule of energy, and so on. And then, so that's one of the reasons, most of these trophic levels, or number of levels, tends to be shorter. So they can't go beyond some point because the energy that you're getting being on top is so little. You are better off being an herbivore than a carnivore, because if you are somewhere sixth in the pyramid, if you're starting with 100 joule, you're getting nothing, basically 0.001 something. So that's why, because there is very little energy that is transferred across trophic levels, you don't see much more elongated food chains and food webs in terms of trophic levels. But another interesting thing that happens with trophic levels is this concept of trophic cascade. So basically, these are powerful indirect interactions that can control entire ecosystems. So, for instance, if you look here, just look at the simple, food chain where there is an herbivore grazing on a producer, and then there is a bird that is eating up the herbivore. So, directly, the producer is getting negatively affected by herbivore, right? Because it is getting predator, it is getting eaten up, and similarly, this herbivore is getting eaten up by predator. So by eating up this herbivore, the bird is indirectly having a positive effect on the plant, because uh, the more the herbivores the bird eats, the lesser the herbivore feeds on producers. So that's how it can have an indirect positive impact on the producers. So in such cases, when you uh, decrease the population or remove one of those trophic levels, it has a cascading impacts on on the simultaneous other trophic levels. So so that's why predators are sometimes are really important in many ecosystems, because they does most of the time they does this indirect positive feedback in maintaining those ecosystems. One such famous example uh, is the introduction of wolves in Yellowstone National Park, where when the wolves were hunted to extinction, the deer species that was there, it was feeding on producers and then changing the whole ecosystems as such. So after the introduction of wolves, what happened? So because the wolves were having a negative impact on their feeding on those deer species, that led to a positive influence on the producers, and their numbers again increase, and then the ecosystem came back to its original state. So that's why understanding these relationship between species and how do they interact is also going to help. And then how do you measure some of those things, like for instance primary production? So primary production is basically is a measure of how much the primary producers are producing in terms of organic matter, either through photosynthesis or chemosynthesis. So one such thing is gross primary productivity, net primary productivity. Gross is basically the total amount, whatever the plant produces. While net primary productivity is what is allocated in the plant, present in the plant at that instant. So how do we calculate net primary productivity? Or basically gross primary productivity minus respiration, because it has lost some of those productivity towards respiration. So you can simply calculate if you have respiration and gross primary productivity value. So what is the thing that is net present in the plant? You can calculate using very simple formula. And yeah, so just winding it up, we just I just went briefly over what different fields of ecology are. How do we study single species? How do we study different aspects of a species? How the population changes? How do different species interact? In terms of how do we model that, and then how multiple species interact in terms of food chains and food webs. And we all know that we have been, as humans, we have been altering most of these ecosystems, and are responsible for disappearance of many species. Sorry. So what we generally try to do is try to conserve some species. So we come up with this concept of red listing species, IUCN red list. That's what it does. So whenever you have species that you generally try to assess this using this status. What's the status of the species? Its least concern, its population is present in huge numbers. There are multiple criteria that goes on. So you align them in a order of extinction, their extinction risk. So as the extinction risk increases, you try to put much more conservation efforts onto those species which are much more prone to extinction. So all this understanding that we do earlier eventually boils up down to here. If you are interested in understanding conservation, doing conserving species, sometimes they can be just to understand how species work, how life works generally. Sometimes you just study ecology to understand how things work out. That's it. For instance, that IUCN Red List says that more than 42,000 species are threatened with extinction. That too, it's not all the species that are present on Earth have been assessed. Out of the 28% that have been assessed, 42,000 are prone to extinction. And there are different numbers that which group is threatened with extinction and which group is not. So some of these understanding that is done in ecology, eventually boils down to, and you know sometimes to conserve species, sometimes to understand how species works, how different things works in the system. Yeah. Yes. Yeah, that's all I have for today. So yeah, if you guys have any questions, sorry, yeah, please feel free to ask, or any clarifications. I'll try to take, yeah, I can 5 to 10 minutes I can spend and help you with that. And yeah, that's all. And all the best for people who are preparing for the exam. And yeah, thank you for joining these sessions. It has been, hope this has been learning, a nice learning experience for you. So yeah, I will wait for 2 more minutes for people, if there are any questions for people to ask. If not, that will be this is the end of the session. I will wait for a minute or two for people to respond if they have any questions. So if you don't have any questions, feel free to leave. Okay. Since it seems no one has any questions, we'll stop the session here. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you for joining. All the best for your exam.